Welcome to WispHollow Tales, where shadows hold secrets and every whisper carries the weight of the past. Tonight, we venture into a remote mountain town, where the quiet life of Frank is about to be shattered by a haunting tied to a devastating flood from years ago. The echoes of that tragedy linger in the air, and as Frank uncovers the dark history of his home, he is drawn into a mystery that refuses to stay buried. Prepare yourself for a tale of sorrow, redemption, and the unrelenting power of a mother's love. This is the story of the woman in white and the river that took everything from her. Now let the story unfold. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long, ominous shadows over the small, isolated town where Frank lived. The mountains loomed high, cradling the town in their jagged arms, with only the narrow, winding road leading out to the nearest city over an hour away. The town was a place where time seemed to stand still, its lifeblood tied to the coal mines that lay deep within the earth. For Frank, the town had always been home, but the sense of isolation had become more palpable lately, almost suffocating. Frank's house, perched on the edge of a slow-moving river, was old and weathered, much like everything else in the town. It had withstood countless storms and seasons, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of years gone by. As he stood by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something subtle but unsettling. The river, which had always been a source of calm, now seemed to hold a strange, quiet tension, as if it were hiding secrets beneath its dark surface. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the familiar noises of the house began to fill the silence. The creaking of the wooden steps, the distant groan of the floorboards, and the soft, almost imperceptible whispers that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. Frank had lived in the house for many years, long enough to recognize its sounds, but tonight they felt different, more deliberate, more insistent. Frank tried to ignore the growing sense of unease, telling himself it was just the house settling as it always did. But as the night deepened, the noises became impossible to dismiss. The creaks on the stairs sounded heavier, like the footsteps of someone or something moving slowly through the darkness. The whispers seemed to close in around him, becoming louder, more urgent, though he couldn't make out what they were saying. All he knew was that something was wrong, terribly wrong. He lay in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as the house seemed to come alive around him. The air felt thick, pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. His heart pounded in his chest, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something in the house was trying to reach out to him. But what did it want? Frank had no idea, and the fear of the unknown gripped him, holding him in place. The hours dragged on, each minute ticking by with agonizing slowness. Frank could hear the river outside, its gentle current lapping against the shore, but even that sound was tainted with a sense of unease. The house groaned again, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the walls, and Frank felt the vibrations under his feet, unsettling and strange. He knew he couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was happening in the house, something that defied explanation. As the night stretched on, Frank finally admitted to himself that he was afraid. The house, once a place of comfort and safety, had become something else entirely. It was as if the very walls were closing in on him, the whispers growing louder, more desperate, as if pleading for him to listen. But Frank was too scared to do anything but lie there, frozen in fear, his mind racing with possibilities. The first light of dawn finally began to creep through the curtains, casting a pale glow over the room. The house was silent now, the whispers and creaks having faded away with the night, but Frank knew they would return. Whatever was happening in the house, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. As he lay there, exhausted and shaken, he resolved to find out what was causing the disturbances before it drove him mad. The next time the night came, he would be ready, or so he hoped. The following night arrived all too quickly for Frank, though the day had felt impossibly long. He had spent the hours of daylight restlessly pacing the house, trying to convince himself that the previous night's events were nothing more than his imagination playing tricks on him. But as dusk fell and the shadows lengthened, the familiar sense of unease returned, settling over the house like a heavy fog. By the time the sun had fully set, Frank was already on edge, his nerves frayed from the tension that had been building all day. He tried to distract himself, flipping through an old book, but the words blurred together on the page, his mind too preoccupied with the anticipation of what the night might bring. The whispers had started again, soft at first, barely audible over the creaking of the floorboards, but growing louder as the hours passed. It was well past midnight when Frank finally gave up on sleep and sat up in bed, staring into the darkness. The whispers seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, surrounding him, filling the room with their eerie, insistent murmur. His heart pounded in his chest, and he strained to make out the words, but they remained just out of reach, like the memory of a dream slipping away the moment you try to grasp it. Then suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, pressing in on Frank from all sides. He held his breath, his body tense, waiting for something, anything to break the stillness. And then he saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a faint, ghostly light at the top of the staircase. Frank's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, he thought it was just another trick of the light. But as he stared, the flicker grew stronger, more defined, until he could see the outline of a figure, a woman, dressed in a long, flowing nightgown, her form pale and shimmering in the darkness. Paralyzed with fear, Frank watched as the woman began to move, her feet hovering just above the stairs as she glided silently down the steps. Her hair was dark and tangled, her face both beautiful and haunting, with eyes that seemed to look straight through him. Frank's mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, but all he could feel was the cold grip of terror. As the woman reached the bottom of the stairs, she paused, her head turning slightly, as if she were listening for something. Frank's heart pounded in his ears, his breath shallow and ragged, but he couldn't move, couldn't look away. The woman's gaze swept across the room, her eyes distant, unfocused, as if she were searching for something or someone that wasn't there. Finally, mustering every ounce of courage he had, Frank forced himself to move. His legs felt like lead, but he managed to stand, crossing the room with slow, deliberate steps. He reached the top of the stairs just in time to see the woman glide towards the front door. She moved with an unnatural grace, her feet never touching the ground, and as she approached the door, it creaked open on its own, allowing her to pass through without a sound. Frank hesitated at the top of the stairs, his heart in his throat. He knew he should follow her, but his fear held him back, rooting him to the spot. Finally, he took a deep breath and forced himself to descend the stairs, his hand gripping the banister so tightly his knuckles turned white. When he reached the bottom, he paused by the window next to the door, peering out into the yard. Through the glass, he saw the woman's figure moving across the yard, heading towards the boat dock that jutted out into the river. Her form was faint now, almost blending into the mist that clung to the water's edge, but Frank could still see her, her nightgown billowing softly in the breeze. He watched, transfixed, as she reached the end of the dock and stopped, her form dissolving into the fog. And then, just like that, she was gone, leaving behind only the sound of the river's gentle current and the echo of the door swinging shut behind her. Frank stood frozen by the window, his mind reeling. Had he really seen her? Or had the darkness finally driven him mad? But deep down, he knew the truth. This was no dream, no figment of his imagination. The woman was real, and whatever she wanted, it was something Frank couldn't ignore. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Frank finally allowed himself to breathe again. The house was silent now, but the memory of the woman lingered. Her image burned into his mind. He knew that this was only the beginning, that the mystery of the woman in the nightgown was something he had to unravel. And as much as he feared what he might find, he knew he had no choice but to investigate further. Tomorrow, he would begin his search for answers, starting with the history of the house and the river that flowed beside it. The morning light filtered weakly through the thick curtains, casting long shadows across the floor of Frank's living room. He hadn't slept at all. After the encounter with the ghostly figure, any thought of rest had vanished. Instead, he had spent the early hours of the morning pacing the house, trying to make sense of what he had seen. His mind raced with questions. Who was the woman? Why was she in his house? And what connection did she have to the river and the dock? Determined to find answers, Frank sat down at his old wooden desk, the surface cluttered with papers and the remnants of half-forgotten projects. He needed to learn more about the history of the house and the town, something that might explain the haunting. His fingers drummed anxiously on the desk as he thought about where to start. The local library seemed the most logical place to begin. Though it was small, the library housed records that stretched back decades, documenting the town's history in meticulous detail. If there was anything to be found about his house or the river, it would be there. As he walked into the library, the musty smell of old books and yellowed paper greeted him. The librarian, an elderly woman with sharp eyes, looked up from behind the counter and gave him a curious glance. Frank rarely visited the library, and he could tell by her expression that she was surprised to see him. "Morning," Frank muttered, nodding at her as he made his way to the section of town records. The old wooden shelves creaked under the weight of countless documents and books. Frank scanned the titles, pulling out several volumes that looked promising. He carried them to a nearby table, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. If he found something here, it could either bring him closer to understanding the ghostly presence in his home or reveal truths he wasn't ready to face. Hours passed as Frank pored over the records, flipping through pages of old newspapers, property records, and faded photographs. The town's history was as grim as he had expected: stories of mining accidents, tragic deaths, and the hardships faced by the early settlers. But nothing seemed to stand out, nothing that could explain the woman he had seen. Just as he was about to give up, something caught his eye. An old newspaper clipping, yellowed with age, tucked between the pages of a book on local legends. The headline read, "Flood devastates town, dozens missing, feared dead." Frank's breath caught in his throat as he read on. The article was dated decades ago, long before he had moved into the house. It detailed a massive flood that had swept through the valley, destroying homes and taking lives in its wake. The river, swollen with relentless rain, had burst its banks, and the devastation had been swift and unforgiving. As he read further, Frank's blood ran cold. Among the missing was a woman named Lillian Warren, who had lived in the very house Frank now called home. The article mentioned that she had been seen just before the flood, cradling her infant child. Neither of them had ever been found. The search had been called off after weeks of fruitless efforts, and the town had moved on. But the memory of the tragedy lingered, a shadow over the town's history. Frank sat back in his chair, the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. Lillian Warren, could she be the woman he had seen? And if so, what had happened to her child? The questions swirled in his mind, a storm of fear and curiosity. He knew now that the past was reaching out to him, demanding to be heard. The apparition wasn't just a ghost. It was a mother searching for something, or someone, lost to the river's cruel embrace. The sun was already beginning to set as Frank closed the book and pushed it aside. His hands trembled slightly as he gathered the documents and returned them to their shelves. The day had given him more questions than answers, but he was closer now, closer to understanding the tragedy that haunted his home. As he left the library, the cool evening air brushing against his face, Frank knew that his search was far from over. The night would come again, bringing with it the whispers, the creaks, and the ghostly figure of Lillian Warren. But this time, he would be ready. He had uncovered part of the truth, and now he needed to find the rest. Tomorrow, he would go to the river. He would search the dock, the place where Lillian had disappeared, and see if the waters would give up their secrets. The next morning, Frank stood by the edge of the river, the mist from the water swirling around his feet. The air was cool and damp, carrying with it the earthy scent of the riverbank. The boat dock extended out into the murky water, its wooden planks weathered and worn from years of exposure to the elements. The dock had always been a familiar sight to Frank, a place where he would occasionally sit and let his thoughts drift with the current. But today, it felt different, ominous even. The discovery at the library the day before had shaken him to his core. The name Lillian Warren echoed in his mind, along with the image of the woman he had seen descending the stairs. He couldn't shake the feeling that the answers he sought lay somewhere in the cold, dark water of the river. The thought of what he might find sent a shiver down his spine, but he knew he had no choice. He had to follow the clues, no matter where they led. Frank stepped onto the dock, the wood creaking under his weight. The sound was eerily similar to the creaking he heard at night in his house, and it sent a fresh wave of unease through him. He walked slowly, his eyes scanning the surface of the river as if it might reveal its secrets with a simple glance. But the water remained stubbornly opaque, its depths hidden beneath a layer of swirling mist. He reached the end of the dock and paused, looking out over the water. This was where she had disappeared, where the river had claimed her and her child. Frank could almost feel her presence here, a lingering sadness that hung in the air like a veil. He closed his eyes, trying to imagine what it must have been like, Lillian standing on this very spot, holding her child as the floodwaters surged around them. Had she been frightened, desperate? Or had she resigned herself to her fate, knowing there was no escape? The thought was too much to bear, and Frank opened his eyes, trying to shake off the oppressive sense of sorrow. He knelt down at the edge of the dock, peering into the water below. The river was dark, its surface reflecting the dull gray of the sky above. But as he looked closer, he noticed something, a faint glimmer beneath the surface, something pale and unnatural. Frank's heart skipped a beat. He leaned in closer, squinting to get a better look. The glimmer was still there, unmoving, just a few feet beneath the water. It looked like fabric. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. Could it be? He reached out, hesitating for a moment before plunging his hand into the cold water. The shock of the chill made him gasp, but he pushed past it, feeling around for the object. His fingers brushed against something soft, and his breath caught in his throat. He grabbed hold of it, pulling it closer to the surface. As he lifted the object from the water, Frank's stomach turned. It was a piece of white fabric, tattered and stained from years of being submerged. But it wasn't just any fabric. It was a part of a nightgown, eerily similar to the one he had seen on the ghostly figure. His mind reeled as he realized what this meant. This was real. Lillian Warren wasn't just a ghost, she was a victim, and this dock was part of her story. Frank stared at the fabric in his hand, his thoughts racing. What had happened here? Why had she been at the dock? And where was her child? The discovery left him with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear: he was on the right path. The river had given up one of its secrets, but there were more to uncover. He carefully placed the fabric on the dock beside him, his mind spinning with possibilities. He needed to search further to find out what else the river might be hiding. The answers were here, somewhere in the cold depths, waiting to be found. As Frank stood up, the mist began to thicken, wrapping around him like a shroud. The river, usually so quiet, seemed to hum with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, as if it were trying to communicate something. Frank turned and walked back down the dock, his steps slow and deliberate. He knew now that this was just the beginning. There was more to discover, and the only way to find the truth was to keep digging, to keep searching. As he left the dock behind, heading back toward the house, Frank felt a strange sense of resolve. He was scared, yes, but he was also determined. The woman had come to him for a reason, and he was going to find out what it was, even if it meant confronting the darkest parts of the past. That night, Frank found himself unable to sit still. The discovery at the dock had left him rattled, but it had also fueled a burning need to uncover the truth. The fragment of the nightgown he had pulled from the river was more than just a piece of cloth. It was a connection to the past, a tangible link to the tragedy that had unfolded all those years ago. He knew he had to keep searching, but as the sun set and the shadows crept back into the corners of his home, a new fear began to take hold. The house felt different tonight. The whispers, usually soft and distant, had become more insistent, their voices rising and falling like the wind. The creaking floorboards seemed louder, the groaning of the old wooden beams more pronounced. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to Frank's discovery with a renewed intensity. He could feel it in the air, thick and heavy, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. As he sat in the dim light of the living room, the silence between the whispers felt oppressive, each pause pregnant with a sense of impending doom. He kept glancing toward the staircase, half expecting the ghostly figure to appear again, gliding silently down the steps. But tonight, she did not come. Instead, the house itself seemed to close in on him, the walls tightening, the air growing colder with each passing minute. Frank's heart pounded in his chest, his anxiety building with each creak and groan. He knew he needed to keep his wits about him, but the oppressive atmosphere made it difficult to think clearly. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow more menacing. The whispers began to coalesce into something almost coherent, words just on the edge of understanding. He strained to listen, but the fear was too great, clouding his thoughts and making his heart race. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frank shivered as a cold draft swept through the house, sending papers flying off the desk and rustling the curtains. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him in a chaotic frenzy, and for a moment, Frank felt as though he might lose his grip on reality. He stood up, his body tense, every muscle coiled with fear. The house felt alive, as if it were trying to push him out, to drive him away from the truth he was so desperate to uncover. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. The whispers fell silent, the lights stabilized, and the cold draft dissipated, leaving the house eerily still. Frank stood in the center of the room, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He had been on the brink of something terrible and powerful, but now the house was quiet again, as if it had spent its fury and retreated into itself. But the silence was not comforting. It was the kind of silence that came before a storm, heavy with tension and unspoken threats. Frank knew that whatever had just happened, it was far from over. The house wasn't done with him yet. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden, sharp knock at the front door. The sound echoed through the silent house, loud and jarring in the stillness. Frank's heart leapt into his throat as he turned toward the door, his body frozen with fear. Who could be visiting at this hour? And why? He hesitated, every instinct telling him to stay where he was, to ignore the knock and retreat to the safety of his bedroom. But something compelled him to move forward, to answer the call. He approached the door slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for the knob. The house was deathly quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of the trees outside. Frank took a deep breath, steeling himself, and opened the door. No one was there. Frank's heart pounded as he stepped out onto the porch, looking around. The night was calm, the river flowing silently in the distance. But as he scanned the yard, his eyes caught sight of something on the dock. A figure barely visible in the darkness, standing at the very end. Frank's breath caught in his throat as he realized who it was. Lillian Warren. She stood there, her back to him, her white nightgown glowing faintly in the moonlight. Frank felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he watched her, unsure of what to do. She wasn't moving, just standing there, as if waiting for something or someone. The sight filled Frank with a deep sense of dread. The house had grown still, but the presence outside was undeniable, a reminder that the haunting was far from over. Whatever had been unleashed in the house was connected to this woman, and Frank knew that his journey into the past was only just beginning. Slowly, he backed away from the door, closing it softly behind him. The knock, the flickering lights, the cold draft had all pointed to something dark and unresolved. The house had given him a glimpse of what lay ahead, and it was not something he could face unprepared. As he retreated to his bedroom, Frank resolved to find out more about Lillian Warren and the flood that had claimed her life. There was more to this story, more that the river and the house were trying to tell him. But for now, he needed to rest. Tomorrow, he would delve deeper into the town's history, and perhaps then he would find the answers he so desperately needed. The next morning, Frank awoke feeling more drained than ever. His sleep had been fitful, haunted by dreams he couldn't quite remember, but that left him with an overwhelming sense of dread. The house was quiet now, bathed in the soft light of dawn, but the events of the previous night were still fresh in his mind. The ghostly figure of Lillian Warren, the cold draft, the strange knock at the door, all of it pointed to something far darker than he had initially imagined. Determined to find answers, Frank returned to the library. The librarian, who had seen him leave abruptly the day before, gave him a knowing look as he approached the records section again. This time, Frank was focused. He needed to know more about the flood that had swept through the town, the flood that had claimed Lillian and so many others. He spent hours sifting through old newspapers, town records, and personal accounts, piecing together the story of the flood. The disaster had struck without warning, following weeks of relentless rain that had swollen the river beyond its banks. The town had been caught off guard, and the water had surged through the streets, destroying homes and lives in a matter of hours. As Frank read, a pattern began to emerge. The flood hadn't just claimed lives, it had left a lasting mark on the town's psyche. The newspapers spoke of the devastation, but there were also mentions of strange occurrences in the aftermath, ghostly sightings, unexplained noises, and whispers that seemed to carry through the ruins of the destroyed homes. The town had tried to rebuild, but the memories of the flood lingered, a dark cloud over everything. Then, Frank found a series of articles that made his blood run cold. Several of the missing, including Lillian Warren and her baby, had been presumed dead, their bodies never recovered. But in the weeks following the flood, there had been reports of a woman in white, seen wandering the riverbank at night, her cries echoing through the mist. The sightings had been dismissed as the imaginings of traumatized survivors, but the frequency of the reports was too consistent to ignore. Frank's hands shook as he read the accounts, each one more detailed than the last. The descriptions of the woman matched the figure he had seen in his house, the flowing white nightgown, the long dark hair, the haunting presence that seemed to be searching for something. The articles mentioned that Lillian Warren had been a new mother, deeply attached to her infant son, who had also vanished in the flood. The connection was undeniable. As he delved deeper into the records, Frank felt a growing unease. The flood had taken so much from the town homes, lives, and a sense of safety that had never fully returned. Lillian Warren and her child were just two of the many lives lost, but their stories seemed to have left a particularly deep scar. The dock, where Lillian had last been seen, was mentioned repeatedly in the accounts, described as a place where the past still lingered, refusing to be forgotten. Frank closed the final book with a sense of dread settling deep in his gut. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was far more terrifying than he had anticipated. The flood, the deaths, the hauntings, it was all connected. The river had taken Lillian Warren and her child, and now it was reaching out to him, pulling him into its dark, tragic history. As he left the library, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the streets. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. Frank knew he had to return to the house, but the thought filled him with a deep sense of foreboding. The more he uncovered, the more dangerous the situation seemed. He was in over his head, but there was no turning back now. Walking back through the quiet streets, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The town, usually so familiar and unremarkable, seemed different, darker, more menacing. The houses, the trees, even the very air seemed charged with an unseen energy, as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. As he approached his house, the river came into view, its surface calm and deceptively peaceful. But Frank knew better now. Beneath that placid exterior lay the truth, a truth he was only beginning to grasp. The river had taken Lillian Warren and her child, and now it was drawing him into its depths, pulling him into a mystery that had remained unsolved for too long. He stepped onto the porch, his heart pounding in his chest. The house loomed before him, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Frank took a deep breath and opened the door, stepping inside. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was deafening. He knew that tonight would be another sleepless night, another encounter with the past that refused to stay buried. But this time, he was armed with knowledge. He knew the story, knew the names and faces of those who had suffered, and he knew that the answers he sought were close, so close he could almost feel them. But at what cost? Frank wasn't sure. All he knew was that he couldn't stop now. He had to see it through, to find the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. As he closed the door behind him, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping softly against the windows. The storm was coming, and with it, the past would rise once more. The storm rolled in swiftly that night, the rain hammering against the roof with a ferocity that made Frank feel like the house itself was trembling. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the river in brief, harsh bursts, and thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. Frank stood by the window, staring out at the dock where the pale form of Lillian Warren had appeared so many times. Tonight, he knew, would be the last. He had spent the day immersing himself in the town's history, learning all he could about the flood and its victims, but it had all come down to this moment. The river, the dock, Lillian's ghost, they were all connected, all pieces of a puzzle that Frank was now ready to solve. The ghost hadn't come to haunt him. She had come to lead him to the truth, and Frank could feel it in his bones that tonight would bring that truth to light. Suddenly, the whispers began again, louder than they had ever been before. They surged through the house, filling every corner, twisting and echoing in ways that made Frank's skin crawl. The lights flickered, and the air grew impossibly cold, as if the very house were reacting to what was about to happen. Frank braced himself, his heart pounding as he made his way to the front door. He stepped outside, the rain immediately soaking through his clothes as he walked across the yard toward the dock. His breath was shallow, fear clawing at his insides, but he forced himself forward. The river was churning, the storm driving the water into violent waves that slapped against the shore. But Frank's eyes were fixed on the dock, where the ghostly figure of Lillian Warren stood once again, her back to him, her white nightgown billowing in the wind. Frank approached slowly, every step feeling heavier than the last. As he reached the dock, he hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the railing as the wind howled around him. Lillian stood at the end of the dock, facing the river, her posture rigid and sorrowful. Frank called out to her, his voice shaky but determined. "Lillian," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Why are you here? What do you want?" For a moment, nothing happened. The storm raged on, the wind whipping through the trees, and Lillian remained silent. But then, slowly, she turned to face him. Her eyes, filled with sorrow and longing, locked onto his, and Frank felt a chill run down his spine. She didn't speak, but her gaze said everything. It wasn't revenge she sought. It was closure. Without a word, Lillian extended her hand, pointing down toward the water beneath the dock. Frank followed her gesture, his heart racing as he knelt at the edge of the dock and peered into the churning river below. The water was dark and violent, but as the lightning flashed again, Frank saw something beneath the surface, something small and pale, caught between the beams of the dock. His breath caught in his throat as realization dawned on him. It was a small bundle, wrapped in what remained of a tattered blanket. Frank's hands shook as he reached into the water, grasping the bundle and pulling it free. As he lifted it into the air, he saw the tiny remains of a child, long decayed but unmistakably present. It was Lillian's baby, the child she had lost in the flood all those years ago, swept away by the river and forgotten beneath the dock. Frank's heart ached as he held the bundle close, his mind reeling with the weight of the discovery. He turned back to Lillian, who now stood closer, her eyes filled with a deep, quiet sadness. She had never been looking for vengeance. She had been searching for her child, the soul she had lost in the waters. And now, finally, Frank had found what she could not. Tears blurred his vision as Frank gently laid the bundle on the dock, his hands trembling. He whispered a prayer, though he wasn't sure if anyone was listening. It was the only thing he could think to do, the only way he could offer Lillian and her child the peace they deserved. He knew, deep down, that this was not the end he would need to ensure the child was given a proper resting place, to finally close this chapter of the tragedy. As the storm began to ease, Frank looked up to see Lillian one last time. She stood at the end of the dock, her figure bathed in the soft glow of the moon that had begun to break through the clouds. She gave Frank a small, grateful smile before slowly fading into the mist, her form dissolving like smoke until there was nothing left but the calm, quiet river. The air was still now, the storm passing, and Frank stood alone on the dock, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. He felt a strange sense of relief, knowing that Lillian and her child had finally found peace. The house, the whispers, the haunting presence, it was all over. The past had been laid to rest, and the river, at last, was silent. With a heavy sigh, Frank gathered the bundle in his arms and made his way back to the house. There would be no more restless nights, no more ghostly apparitions. He had done what he needed to do, what Lillian had been waiting for him to do. As he crossed the threshold of his home, he felt a sense of closure, a quiet understanding that the spirits of the past had finally moved on. Frank closed the door behind him and sat down in the living room, his body weary but his mind clear. The storm had passed, and with it, the mystery of the woman in white had finally come to an end. All that remained was the quiet sound of the river flowing outside a sound that, for the first time in a long while, felt peaceful. Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey through the shadows of WispHollow Tales. If Frank's story has chilled your spine and tugged at your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales that delve into the eerie and the unknown. Every story holds a secret, and every secret has its time to be revealed. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, some spirits just need to be heard.